Outline of Ethics for Heart-Centered Therapies by Katie Macbeth. The 20 areas of ethics will be explained in detail in an effort to increase the working knowledge about ethical issues and principles for mental health professionals. This author will especially focus on those therapists utilizing heart-centered therapies. In a course taught at the Wellness Institute for Psychotherapists of all specialties, addresses a variety of ethics topics and served as a continuing education course to increase the knowledge of mental health professionals about ethical issues and principles, specifically those who utilize heart-centered therapies. This presentation concentrates on the practical applications of these principles in the mental health profession. The Wellness Institute identifies 4 objectives when outlining ethical procedures and practices for heart-centered therapists. Number 1, identify 3 conditions under which crossing boundaries in psychotherapy might be ethical and appropriate. Number 2, understand the factors that therapists should consider regarding what and when to document. Number 3, name at least 3 essential areas of obtaining valid informed consent prior to providing services to a client. Number 4, know clearly the special ethical considerations when integrating spirituality and religion into psychotherapy and when working with non-ordinary states of consciousness, such as hypnosis. Informed consent, competence, dual relationships, self-care, fees, documentation, availability, confidentiality, multicultural competence, self-disclosure, integrating spirituality and religion into clinical practice, mandatory reporting, consultation, identifying high-risk clients, terminating psychotherapy, expanded forms of seeing the invisible, working with non-ordinary states of consciousness, working with groups, touch and body work, working with children. Informed consent is a principle of ethical treatment based on the core value of self-determination. It is a value in the helping profession that individual has the right to determine for him or herself the kind of treatment they receive and indeed whether they participate in treatment at all. The individual requires and deserves to have adequate information to fully assess whether and how they wish to participate in treatment. Informed consent is basic to professional practice and has clearly been established as an important standard of care. Informed consent minimally should include a discussion of financial issues and the basic nature of the services that are and are not provided. It should also address confidentiality, privacy issues, including the federal HIPAA and state statutory exceptions to confidentiality and privacy. Informed consent also should address who is and who is not a patient and what access to records patients or others will have. Informed consent is only possible when consent is given voluntarily by a legal person of legal age, mentally competent to refuse or consent based on sufficiently thorough and accurate information in order to weigh the benefits and risks of treatment. The following categories of information should be included in initial intake paperwork and easily available to the client. On-call coverage. It's important to review any on-call coverage arrangements with all patients at the outset of the professional relationship. Who provides coverage, what their competence is, how to contact them, when it is appropriate to contact them, any fees involved, and how confidentiality is addressed all should be discussed in advance. Confidentiality, by openly addressing confidentiality issues during the informed consent process and over time as they are relevant, the clinician develops a collaborative relationship with the client that is based on trust and an understanding of the parameters of the professional relationship. Confidentiality might include such measures as soundproofing the office, storing treatment records in a secure location, using passwords and other security measures with computers, not discussing confidential information in public or with unauthorized people, and releasing only the minimum necessary information when responding to a lawful request for information. Clear disclosure of one's training and experience is a basic requirement of any professional. It is unethical to embellish or otherwise falsify one's education, experience history, or qualifications, whether it be with clients, third-party payers, or colleagues. Spirituality and religion include questions about spirituality and religion in the initial intake paperwork and in the initial assessment of each client. This establishes as part of the informed consent that these issues are appropriate to be included in the therapeutic process. Unless a mental health practice is clearly established as representing a parochial, religious, or spiritual point of views, inclusion of these issues should be generic, and the therapist needs to carefully avoid allowing his or her own beliefs to contaminate the client's resolution of their spiritual struggles. Fees and policies regarding fees need to be stated clearly at the outset. In fact, it may be very helpful to discuss these issues in the initial telephone contact even before you actually meet the client. For many clients, knowing the fees charged for treatment, expectations for when payment is due, if the therapist works in network, out of network, or fee for service, if credit cards are accepted, and related financial details can impact an individual's decision to enter treatment. A clear policy on missed appointment and late cancellation charges. This policy should be reviewed in the informed consent process. The policy used should be clear and fair. Further, it should be the client who requests a barter arrangement, and that should be a clear written agreement. Conflicts of interest. Informing clients of potential or actual conflicts of interest, such as financial interest in certain procedures, products or referrals, or religious interest in persuading a client to decide against abortion or divorce. A conflict of interest exists when the therapist's personal, scientific, professional, legal, financial, or other interests or relationships impair their objectivity with the client, or when it might expose the client to harm or exploitation. When therapists provide services to two or more people who have relationship with each other, they should clarify with all parties which individuals will be considered clients and the nature of the therapist's professional obligations to the various individuals who are receiving the services. Therapists who anticipate a conflict of interest among the individuals receiving services or who anticipate having to perform in potentially conflicting roles should clarify their role with the parties involved and take appropriate action to minimize any conflict of interest. Mandatory reporting requirements should be disclosed as part of the initial informed consent process. These requirements are set by law and vary by state. It is a mental health professional's responsibility to represent themselves and to practice only within the boundaries of their education, experience, training, licensure or certification, and level of supervisory or consultant support. Failure to provide services within accepted standards, in other words, incompetency, is the second most common form of ethics violation alleged in complaints to social work licensing boards. The most common alleged ethic failure is boundary violation. One should refrain from making false, misleading, deceptive, or unsubstantiated claims or statements in resumes, advertising, and other means of soliciting clients. One needs to avoid setting unrealistic expectations for a prospective client in order to attract them to become a paying client, such as that the proposed therapy will cure a diagnosed disease or presenting issues can be resolved in 6 sessions or less. The professional must not inflate their own competencies, nor those of the therapeutic modality to be offered. Dual relationships. Dual relationships are defined as engaging in the therapy relationship as well as one or more additional relationships with that individual or one related to or closely associated with the client. These might include other relationships that are social, business, sexual, or others. This is the area of boundary violation that creates the most trouble for mental health professionals. Of course, some dual relationships are clearly and absolutely forbidden, for example, any sexual interaction. These are some examples of gray areas that might be provided mental health services to someone who teaches at a children's local public school, or to someone who works at a local bank, or to someone who attends the same church or synagogue. Bartering for services is an example in which you may find a way for an individual to obtain much needed help, but who is unable to pay for the services. The overriding criteria for appropriateness of these dual relationships is whether the client is potentially being exploited through the imbalance of power that automatically exists within the therapist-client relationship. Either case, the therapist is responsible for setting and communicating clear, appropriate, and culturally sensitive boundaries with the client. Inappropriate dual relationships can involve current clients, but also others, former clients, colleagues, assistants, supervisees, and students. Other clients, family members, social workers, and psychologists are prohibited from providing clinical services to individuals with whom they had prior sexual relationships, or engaging in sexual activities or sexual contact with former clients except in extraordinary circumstances. Boundaries help establish the ground rules for the professional relationship and include dimensions such as time, location, touch, self-disclosure, personal space, money, and gifts, among others. It is widely accepted in the professional literature that each boundary may be crossed at various times without harm. Examples may include accepting small gifts from a client at a holiday time, extending a session for a client in crisis, making a home visit to a terminally ill client, driving across a bridge with a phobic client, or touching a grieving client on the arm or shoulder. It is not just the therapist's intentions, but also the anticipated perceptions of the client that must be considered when determining whether to cross a boundary. Boundary violations involving intimate relationships are the most common misconduct within the realm of dual relationships. Any sexual relationship is clearly forbidden, but there are other less obvious non-sexual relationships that should be avoided as well. An example is friendship that involves sharing social outings together, be it parties, social events, or even conversations over coffee at a restaurant. Other examples might be gift giving or receiving frequent or elaborate gifts, personally identifying with a client's situation and becoming overly involved in the client's life decisions, expressing offensive or derogatory language verbally or in written form to or about a client. Questions for the mental health professional to ask him or herself are, am I engaging in this activity with my client to satisfy my own emotional or dependency needs? Am I rescuing my client when entering into relationship activities that are codependent even though I have altruistic motives? Am I doing this because I feel awkward saying no to the client, or am I feeling at a loss to help the client clinically, therefore the need to do something to avoid experiencing my own impotence or incompetence? Would I do this for any of my other clients, and how might the client interpret my behavior towards him? Self-care. There are a number of factors that place mental health clinicians at increased risk for distress, burnout, compassion fatigue, and impairment. There are personal attributes and histories which many clinicians may have attributed to the attraction to a helping profession, such as tendency to rescue others or take responsibility for their plight. The very nature of this work, including dealing frequently with crisis, may result in both physical and psychic isolation. Some of our clients may not show demonstrable improvement over time or may actually worsen during treatment, leading to erosion of therapist idealism and causing stress. Overburdened workloads or self-imposed unrealistic expectations may contribute to physical and emotional exhaustion. Compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress is a potential result of the professional's immersion in the suffering of those with whom they work. Examples of warning signs for burnout stress may include feeling bored, anxious, fatigued, uninterested, or impatient with clients, and arriving late to or canceling sessions frequently. They may feel that this does not matter to anyone, or that they are ineffective or impotent to alleviate the suffering of those who come for help. Clinicians must also be alert to factors in their personal and professional lives that may put them at increased risk for impairment. These may include family and relationship stressors, financial difficulties, health concerns, aggravation with managed care, changes in their workload, and work with particularly challenging clients. It's important to avoid negative coping behaviors such as avoidance, denial, professional isolation, and self-medicating through compulsive and addictive behaviors or substances. A self-care program may include the personal psychotherapy and a peer supervision or support group, limiting the number of hours one works, taking time for personal pursuits and relationships, taking regular breaks, work, vacations, enduring adequate diet, sleep, and exercise, engage in enjoyable activities and hobbies, varying one's work activities, and striking a balance between different professional and personal activities over time. When deciding to raise one's fees during the course of treatment, adequate notice should be given, and each client's ability to pay the higher fee should be discussed. One option is to increase one's fees for new referrals and keep the fees for current clients the same. Over time, all clients will be paying the higher fee, and the issue of creating a hardship for current clients will be avoided. Address the issue of fees as early as it's possible with the professional or scientific relationship, since this is something that could impact the client's willingness and ability to participate in treatment. It could be very helpful to discuss these issues in the initial telephone contact, even before actually meeting your client. For most clients, knowing the fees charged for treatment, if the therapist works in network, out of network, fee for service, or when payment is due, is very important. A clear policy on missed appointment and late cancellation charges should be reviewed in the informed consent process. The policy used should be clear and fair. The barter system can be used, as mentioned earlier, if it's not exploitive or clinically contradicting. Criteria for determining whether barter is ethically appropriate includes whether it's essential to providing the service negotiated without coercion, entered into the client's initiative, done with the client's informed consent, and is an accepted practice among other professionals in the community. While the use of collection agencies is allowable, it is recommended that prevention is often the best approach to these difficulties. Many clients may find the use of collections agencies as an antagonistic act and may respond with the filing of ethics complaints and malpractice suits. Possible options include meeting less frequently for a period of time, use of a payment plan, reducing one's fees, providing a limited number of pro bono sessions, or a referral to a provider organization with a sliding scale or reduced fee structure. Therapists do not offer or accept kickbacks, rebates, bonuses, or other remuneration for referrals. When considering just what to document, how to document, and when to document, a number of factors should be considered. It's important to consider the possible uses of one's documentation. We should keep in mind the use of documentation for assisting us in providing good care, for assisting future treating professionals, to communicate among other treatment team members, supply colleagues providing coverage with enough relevant information, and to demonstrate a reasonable good faith effort to meet the standards of care of our profession. We can make informed decisions about how detailed and comprehensive our records should be. Additionally, a therapist should keep in mind we may have access to treatment records in the future. Anything included in the treatment records may be accessed by others at a later date to include which could include the client or the client's attorneys or others. Documentation should be objective and factual, absent of personal opinions and value statements, information not relative to the purposes of the professional services being provided, especially since one never knows who may have access to records at a later date. It's not only important to include in documentation those actions we have taken, but also those that we have not taken and the rationale behind our decisions. Record keeping is also an important risk management activity and is a legal requirement in many states. The debate over the necessity to keep records is over. It is now the standard of care. Some practitioners believe that record keeping is dangerous because the records may fall into the wrong hands. The absence of records is a sure loss for the therapist. Good records provide a shield that serves to protect the therapist who is engaged in good practice. Not keeping records or keeping bad records places a weapon in the hands of the plaintiff's attorney because the absence of records is considered a sign of sloppy or problematic professional practice. Records should allow the reader to understand what happened, why it happened, and where therapy was headed. Licensing board complaints prevent the aggrieved patient's perceptions of what happened in the treatment relationship. Often the therapist's view of history is quite different. If the therapist cannot substantiate his or her own version of the events from the treatment record, the licensing board is more likely to accept the patient's version. Most therapists have clearly stated office hours during which they are available for appointments and a means of answering telephone calls during those hours. While this is a good start and would likely work well for most routine matters, it would not appear to meet the needs of those experiencing crisis. It is suggested that some greater access be arranged, such as including an emergency telephone number or cell phone number with a voice message where patients can receive trying to contact you. If they're still not able to reach someone, that a backup is suggested, such as a crisis hotline or instructions to call 911. Even if there's a secretary or receptionist who answers your telephone, such arrangements would still need to be made to address crises after work hours and during the holidays. Confidentiality. As therapists, we do our best to treat information shared by clients as confidential through means such as soundproofing our offices, storing treatment records in a secure location, using passwords, and other security measures. Limits to the exception of confidentiality include when the client consents to the release of information, when laws require it, such as mandatory reporting requirements for suspected abuse and neglect of minors, if the client raises his or her mental state as an issue in litigation, if dangerous situations where there is a duty to warn and protect in response to a lawful court order, and in emergency situations. Multicultural competence can be applied to all individuals because human interaction is anchored in a cultural context. Everyone has a culture and is part of several subcultures, including those related to age, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, national origin, socioeconomic status, language preference, ideology, geographic region, neighborhood, physical disability, and others. No therapist can be expected to know everything about every group, but we can have an awareness of the importance of the multiple aspects of diversity addressed above. The appropriate use of self-disclosure by the psychotherapist may be a very useful and powerful technique. Self-disclosure is that when it's done for the client's benefit within the context of the therapeutic process. Used as a tool to instruct or illustrate, the therapist's disclosure of some past event or problem can help the client overcome barriers to therapeutic process. The self-disclosure should never occur to meet the clinician's needs for intimacy or other personal needs. Recent studies have demonstrated that the integration of spirituality and religion into psychotherapy enhances treatment outcomes and that there's a positive link between religion, spirituality, and health and well-being. Therapists can overstep ethical standards in integrating spirituality and religion into psychotherapy. They can exceed their competence, violate informed consent agreements, engage in inappropriate multiple relationships, impose their own values and beliefs on clients, or overstep their role by espousing authority by performing religious rites. With regard to minors and mandatory reporting, all 50 states have laws that mandate the reporting of suspected abuse or neglect by a parent or caregiver. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services website has a section on mandatory reporters of child abuse and neglect. The summary of state laws provide links to each state's laws. Despite general uniformity, there still remains variability between some states' reporting requirements. Therapists should know how their state defines abuse and neglect and just when making a report is mandatory. When in doubt, it's strongly recommended that the professional call the local reporting agency, describe the situation, and ask if, based on the information provided, an abuse is mandated. It is also an ethical responsibility for professionals to report sexual misconduct or other ethical violations by a colleague. Many states have laws making this a legal requirement as well. Consultation is a basic risk management technique, as well as a way of increasing one's competency. Consultation can be a powerful indicator that the therapist's conduct was professionally appropriate. The standard of care typically used in malpractice cases and licensing board investigations is that of a reasonable professional. According to the APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, reasonable means the prevailing professional judgment of psychologists engaged in similar activities in similar circumstances given the knowledge the psychologist had or should have had at the time. Consultation with other knowledgeable practitioners demonstrates several important points. The therapist recognized a potential problem. The therapist did not act independently. The therapist sought the assistance and input from other practitioners. And the therapist documented the nature and results of the consultation as well as the actions taken or not taken with the rationale for both. Consultation can help to establish the standard of reasonability. By consulting with others, therapists can lend significant strength to their argument that they conducted themselves consistent with the standard of care. Identifying high-risk clients and high-risk situations is an important aspect of prevention. Therapists should take great care to recognize the types of cases that pose the most serious risk and utilize increased risk management in each situation. High-risk situations may include, but are certainly not limited to, conflicts of interest, loss of therapist objectivity, treating patients with a litigious history, treatment involving disputes between parties, and treatment involving custody matters. Most important, therapists should take great care when a therapy relationship becomes adversarial. Sometimes patient anger is an unavoidable aspect of good treatment, but in these situations, recognition and discussion can decrease the risk that the therapeutic relationship will be damaged. Clients with borderline personality disorder tendencies are typically extremely difficult, high conflict, highly litigious individuals. Patients who meet diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder pose special challenges and risks. It's important to establish clear expectations and boundaries with such clients. Set clear, unambiguous boundaries with the patient from the beginning of treatment. Be clear with the patient about the sanctions that will be enforced. Develop a written treatment plan that clarifies the goals and treatments and who's going to be doing what to achieve what goals. Coordinate what you're doing with other healthcare providers. Make it clear from the beginning that you're not the patient's friend, mother, father, or emotional punching bag, that therapy is about change. The patient may be vulnerable to developing false memory syndrome in that patients have great difficulty differentiating between reality and fantasy. Ideas such as journaling, guided imagery, relaxation and training techniques are more appropriate strategies for dealing with intense effects of this population. We have found with numerous individuals diagnosed with borderline personality disorder that age regression hypnotherapy can be safe and effective when rendered with clear boundaries and emphasis on the client's ultimate control. If it is clear that the patient is not benefiting from treatment, assert your ethical responsibility to terminate treatment with appropriate referral or hospitalization. It's important that therapists terminate on the therapeutic process if they have ethical responsibilities to terminate appropriately. The reality is that 1/3 of all clients do not return to psychotherapy after 1 or 2 sessions. Only 10% remain for more than 20 sessions. Some simply stop coming, despite the recommendation of the therapist for a predetermination counseling process. Multiple factors influence how long a client remains in psychotherapy. Ending therapy usually depends on the nature of the case, the condition of the client, the evolution and attainment of goals as set forth by the client and psychotherapist, and the client's financial situation. Ethical responsibilities include the responsibility to terminate when the client no longer needs the service, or isn't benefiting, or is being harmed by such services. The APA Ethics Code standard indicates that therapists have the right to terminate psychotherapy when they are threatened. It is probably not appropriate to terminate when a client is in crisis. Clients usually either indicate that they will call to schedule the next appointment or cancel and do not reschedule. Many people currently utilize psychotherapy in short installments and stop for a while and later return to either the same practitioner or another. When clients who seem successful engage in psychotherapy stop coming, a note or call to provide them with options can yield helpful information. For example, contacting clients who have not returned may focus on concerns for their current status, informing about new therapeutic modalities available since their previous sessions did not work. It's also suggested to have their file terminated, to come in for review and termination, or to return to psychotherapy. Some clients may want you to hold on to their files and hope that they will return. Others may be ready for you to terminate their file. Therapists are trained and hopefully qualified to perceive psychic realities hidden from view at the superficial level of human interaction. This is considered seeing the invisible. One might see what lies behind the obvious, for example, recognizing the embedded unresolved birth issue in a client's claustrophobia or the repressed self-hatred in a client's depression. At a deeper level, the therapist may be capable of perceiving the lingering, energetic presence in a woman's womb of life that was a miscarriage, considered a haunted womb. Likewise, a therapist may be aware of energetic subtleties between people invisible to the untrained eye. For example, recognizing the contagion of shock that pervades the interactive space between her traumatized client and herself. Some therapists are capable of seeing the invisible energies within a client's energy field, whether seeing the quantum radiations of a person's emotional body or seeing through their physical flesh. This is a redeemed form of seeing the subtle and invisible that can potentially benefit people. By studying the radiation's inner structure or shock postures of the people that come to see a therapist, they gain knowledge that is valuable in facilitating their healing process. When utilizing hypnosis or similar trance states in the therapeutic intervention, We provide some descriptions about the phenomenon of hypnosis that reflects theoretical orientation, and this should be included in the initial informed consent materials. This would include what it consists of, how frequent it occurs, how it could be a natural coping mechanism, and also how it can happen spontaneously for some. Hypnosis can also be described as facilitating the development of new skills, behaviors, and thought patterns to be used in place of maladaptive ones, and the further practice strengthens the new learning. When the professional incorporates hypnotic experience in any group or public presentation, he or she must take care to ensure that it's done in a way such to prevent or minimize risk to the known audience participants. This might be accomplished by, for example, telling those who do not wish to go into hypnosis not to close their eyes, or by muting the induction part of a demonstration video. When working with groups, the group leader should lead the group democratically while maintaining the responsibility of leadership. One's leadership should cultivate the free expression of group ideas and feelings, taking into account group dynamics, group energy, and balancing attention to individuals and the group experience. Group confidentiality should extend to all group members. Therefore, the group leader should remind the group of the importance of confidentiality, both for the social protection of the members as well as in order to establish trust. The group leader is responsible to announce the entrance of any potential new member to the group and to assure as much as possible an orderly completion for any group member who is terminating from the group. The group leader should also explain the purpose of any audio or video recordings that may occur and only proceed after approval of all group members. The group leader and the group participants establish a connection comprised of distinct asymmetrical roles which potentially fosters transferential relationships. This means, among all other things, that the leader gains a position of power over the group members. This remains true even after a member has left the group. Although many mental health professionals refrain from any physical contact with clients except for a handshake, there are certainly occasions on which non-sexual physical touch can be helpful to the client. Examples of touch intentionally employed as part of an adjunct to verbal psychotherapy might include a gentle touch on the arm or shoulder to convey empathy when a client is grieving, or a warm hug of greeting or farewell instead of the informal handshake. Therapists should not engage in physical contact with clients when there is a possibility of psychological harm to the client as a result to the contact due to misrepresentation. Therapists who engage in appropriate physical contact with clients are responsible for setting clear, appropriate, and culturally sensitive boundaries that govern such contact, and to obtain client permission for the contact before it is implemented. Psychotherapists should also obtain informed consent prior to using touch-related techniques in the therapeutic process. Therapists recognize that the client's consciousness, verbal, and even written consent for touch, even though genuine, may not accurately reflect objections to touch of which the client is currently unaware. Knowing this, body psychotherapists should strive to be sensitive to the client's spoken and unspoken cues regarding touch and continue to monitor for ongoing informed consent to ensure the continued appropriateness of touch-based interventions. Consent for treatment requires the agreement of both the caregiver and the child when working with children. Children are more sensitive and vulnerable to adult inputs, and the practitioner is therefore obligated to work with extra sensitivity and caution with young clients. Children, especially the very young, may not be able to identify or articulate their problems. Therefore, therapists must often rely on reports from caregivers, schools, and social agencies to determine the nature, severity, and extent of the problem. The child's caregiver must be made aware of the limits of confidentiality regarding the child's issues as part of the informed consent process. Therapists must advise the child that in the event issues arise, whereas in the practitioner's best judgment and in a child's best interest, the issues ought to be discussed with the caregivers or agency. A child will be informed of such an event before the issue is brought up to the adult. In conclusion, the founders of the Wellness Institute are Diane Zimberoff and David Hartman. They also are authors of the ethics program and training material that is used to educate heart-centered therapists on moral principles and procedures and what is covered throughout this presentation. For over 25 years, Diane has trained mental health professionals in heart-centered hypnotherapy, a highly effective and unique clinical model. For 20 years, David has trained mental health professionals in heart-centered hypnotherapy, a highly effective and unique model throughout the United States and in Kuwait, Taiwan, Mexico, South Africa, and Denmark. At this time, I will leave the presentation open for any questions or comments. Thank you.